Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 19th video for the New Testament Survey course. In this section, we'll begin to look at the epistles. We'll look at the Pauline epistles, those written by Paul, and then later we'll look at the general epistles, all the others not written by Paul. But first, in this section, we'll look at the epistles in general, what they are, and how to read them well. So first, what is an epistle? Well, epistle is basically a fancy name for a letter. If I wanted to try to be hip, I'd say that it's an ancient equivalent to an email, a text, or a tweet. But since I don't really care to be hip, I'm not going to say that. An epistle was a means of written communication for speaking to someone over a distance. It functioned to replace the author actually being there, and it had the same authority and impact as if the author was there saying the things, whatever's written in the epistle. And epistles were a very common type of literature. Many everyday examples from the time of the New Testament have been found, written about almost any subject, from love letters to grocery lists. And epistles are occasional documents. That means that they're written for a specific reason in the history of that time. For instance, there was something happening in the church at Corinth that caused Paul to write the letters to the Corinthians, and therefore, epistles were written for a specific purpose. The author was trying to accomplish something, to inform, to encourage, to motivate, or command the readers to do some action. The occasion was what was happening before the letter that caused it to be written, and the purpose is what hopefully happened after the letter was read. It's what happened if the author successfully communicated. And therefore, epistles are not exhaustive theological textbooks. They are task theology, written for a specific purpose and occasion. That means that they're not exhaustive or systematic. They said what needed to be said for that situation, not all that could possibly have been said. So be careful not to argue from silence. And one additional note, ancient writers often used secretaries to write their epistles. In some cases, they dictated the exact words, and in other cases, they gave the general message and let the secretary figure out the exact words. But in both cases, the author read and approved the words used and signed the letter. And just like in modern letters, epistles have some standard general features and outline. For instance, many modern business letters start with something like, "To whom it may concern," and end with, "Yours sincerely," or something like that. And likewise, New Testament epistles follow certain patterns. The general outline for most epistles of that day is as follows. It starts with a salutation, the opening, and this contains, first, the name of the sender, and that's why the very first word in all of Paul's epistles is the word Paul. But Paul also describes himself and/or his situation, and that description can give us some insight into the letter. For instance, sometimes he describes himself in ways that emphasize his authority, and other times he emphasizes his friendliness and love towards the recipients. And next is the name and description of the recipients. For instance, to the church of the Thessalonians. Again, note how he describes them, as this will give clues to the tone and purpose of the letter. Then finally in the salutation is the opening greeting, something like, "Grace and peace be with you." And as usual, notice how the author expands or embellishes the standard greeting. The next is the thanksgiving and/or prayer report. Like the label says, this portion records the author giving thanks for something, usually for the readers. Something like, "I give thanks for you for this reason." So pay attention to what the author gives thanks for and why. And this portion will often record the content of the author's prayers on behalf of the recipients. Something like, "I'm praying for you for such and such." And this also has significance for understanding the letter, so pay attention, especially in Paul. For him, the Thanksgiving prayer report often introduces major themes of the letter. The next is the body of the letter. This is by far the largest part of most letters. In the body, the author covers the main topic or topics that they want to communicate. And the organization of the body varies from epistle to epistle, depending on the topics covered and the purpose of the letter. New Testament epistles, however, typically have a general pattern of indicative, then imperative. That means the author first states the facts, usually the truth about Jesus and the gospel, the indicative. Then the author gives commands or requests that flow from the truth of the gospel, the imperatives. And this pattern is significant, and we'll talk more about it in just a minute. Then is the final blessings and greetings. This section will contain personal greetings and sometimes information about the author's situation, as well as expressions of blessing and hope that the readers would prosper. And then typical epistles ended with a peace wish. This is often just a single phrase, such as, "May peace be with you." So that's the nature and general outline of a typical epistle from that time period. But now let's talk more specifically about the epistles contained in the New Testament. Now these letters obviously all had their own specific occasion and purpose, and we'll look at that for each book when we look at each individual book. But their general purpose and content is to proclaim the gospel of Christ and apply it to the lives and issues of the readers. In general, these epistles tell the good news about Jesus, and they elaborate the truths and implications that are true because of the reality of the gospel, and they address the behavior that is consistent with the truth of the gospel. And of course, this includes teaching that some behavior is no longer an option for those who know and believe the reality of what Christ has done. In other words, the epistles never just tell the readers to behave in certain ways. They do tell them how to live, but they tell them how to live, but give them gospel reasons, which will motivate and strengthen them to be able to live in a Christian manner. So watch for the connection between the gospel and appropriate lifestyle responses, because the gospel changes everything, and the epistles help their readers realize and live in light of this new life. Now, let me give you 3 general categories of gospel truth to watch for in the epistles. The writers consistently talk about these 3 things to give motivation and reasons why their readers should live in certain ways. And the first is the character of God. The epistles talk about God, the way that he is, his attributes, what he likes, what he hates, and his ways shown in his track record of dealing with his people, especially in his activities of sending Christ. Second, they talk about the cross and resurrection of Christ. The epistles constantly talk about Christ's death and resurrection, and they elaborate on the redemption that this provided and how it's central to all of history. They talk about the seriousness of sin, the holiness of God, and the necessity of justice against all sin and rebellion, the unimaginable grace of God to provide a substitute to bear the punishment of our sin, the victory of Christ over every enemy, especially death and the grave, the reality of a renewed relationship with God, because the enmity problem was solved by Christ's atonement, bringing the forgiveness of sins, and the necessity of response on our part. So, how could you not be changed? Because everything has changed. The world is different because Jesus rose from the grave. And this news compels our response, one way or another. And the third is the eschatological reality. That is, where we now are in history. Like we talked about in the last section, we are currently living in the already not yet tension of the kingdom between the 2 ages. So the epistles, they draw attention to the reality of the kingdom that we now experience as power to live a new life. And the epistles also draw attention to promises of the kingdom yet to be revealed as motivation to press forward in faithfulness until that day. So watch for all these three things in the epistles and let these truths work to change your mind, your attitude, and your actions in every area of your life. Now, let's briefly talk about how to read the epistles well. Remember that the Bible, including the epistles, is the Word of God in human words in history. Therefore, pay attention to the historical context. Think first about what the epistle meant to the first readers in their situation. Notice as much as you can about the occasion for each epistle and the purpose it was trying to accomplish in the lives of the first readers. And also pay attention to the literary context. That is, don't take single verses or thoughts by themselves. Rather, pay attention to the overall flow of thought and development of ideas throughout the entire epistle. Understand each individual thought in its place in the larger argument. For instance, just like we've been talking about, think about the commands in the context of the gospel reasons and motivations that the epistle gives for obeying that command. Therefore, we can best understand the epistles by the relationship between three things. First, the content, what the epistles say, and of course this will vary from epistle to epistle because they talk about different issues. But second, the historical context, why it was said in its original occasion. So as much as you can, think about why the author would write this to the first readers based on what you know about their situation. And third, the literary context, how the entire epistle fits together as a whole to communicate the content. Think about how one thought builds upon the previous thought and how the author develops his argument. Especially keep in mind the pattern of indicative to imperative, which means gospel truths, which impact gospel behavior. And all three of these work together to communicate meaning in the epistles. And therefore, notice how the author puts their theology to work in the lives of the readers. How does the author address the truth of the gospel to the historical situation and issues that the readers were facing? What difference does the truth about Jesus make in their lives? What difference should it make? And finally, work to apply that same theology in analogous ways in your own life. As you're reading, ask, what is the gospel? What are the gospel truths communicated in this epistle? And what difference should that make in my own life? How can you obey the purpose of each epistle in your own situation in a way that is faithful to the intended application that the author made to the first readers in their situation? Now, hopefully, these brief suggestions will help you read the epistles profitably. And if you'd like more, there's an entire section on reading epistles in the basic Bible study course. But for now, let's review. Epistles are written communication applying the gospel of Christ to a particular occasion for a specific purpose. And therefore, read the epistles by putting the content in its historical and literary contexts, see how the theology is applied to life, and apply it to your own life. Okay, that's all for this introduction to the New Testament epistles. We'll look at each individual epistle, starting with the Pauline epistles. But first, we're going to introduce the Pauline epistles in the next section by surveying the life and ministry method of Paul. Thanks for watching.